Program 3 of Courtroom Communication Skills. This program is called What to Do with Your Hands. Here's what you'll learn.
You'll understand how thinking, speaking, and gesturing are tightly connected in the brain.
You'll be able to confidently use the 3 prototypical gestures: give, chop, and show.
You'll learn how to suit your actions to your words and your words to the actions of your gestures. To understand what to do with your hands, we have to ask that question about what you do with your hands in everyday conversation. Because if our goal is to be natural, don't you need to know what natural is? So here's my challenge to you. What do you do in conversation with your hands as you think and speak? Do you know? Frankly, most people don't. Because isn't this a set of opposites in human behavior? When we're natural, we are not self-conscious. And when we're self-conscious, we're not natural. So to say to someone, just get up and gesture naturally, is to say to them, do what you're not conscious of. And of course, that's a difficult instruction to follow. So what do you do with your hands? How often do your hands leap into action when you're speaking? How big is that zone of gesturing when you're talking? And then when you are gesturing, how long do those patterns of gesture stay alive? You need to focus on that. You need to now broaden your focus because, of course, the interesting thing about gestures is that they literally are right under your nose, and you probably have paid no attention. People pay so little attention to their own gestures that I have this experience frequently. I say, because it's true to every audience of trial lawyers that I talk to, everyone in this room gestures naturally in conversation. And inevitably, on break or after the presentation, a lawyer approaches me and says, and more importantly, does this. I have to tell you, you said everybody gestures? I never gesture. And then they gesture. And I get to say, well, that's interesting because you just did. At which point they say, well, yeah, that's because you talked about it. And then they try to literally sit on their hands. How can someone say, I never gesture, and gesture as they say that? Well, that's the self-awareness you need to develop. Now, believe me, I'm not saying that you gesture like me or anyone else, but you gesture just like you. We could say you are the world's expert at how you gesture. So now you need to raise your awareness to that. And you need to lay aside anything you've ever heard that says that gestures are inappropriate in the courtroom. History says that's wrong, Shakespeare says that's wrong, neuroscience says that's wrong, and even contemporary practice says that is wrong. Let me give you some examples. If you go all the way back to ancient Rome, and Cicero, the great advocate of ancient Rome, Cicero understood that thinking and speaking and gesturing are tightly connected. In fact, let's go back even before Cicero to ancient Greece. And Simonides, who wrote about oratory, understood that thinking and speaking and gesturing are connected. Let's jump ahead to the Elizabethan era. And what did Shakespeare say? Well, Shakespeare has the perfect summing up of what natural gestures are. He says this: natural gestures are what? Suit the action to the word, and the word to the action. And when you begin to look at gestures, both your own and other people's, you'll realize that that's exactly what natural gestures are. We suit the action to the word and the word to the action. Let's jump all the way to contemporary neuroscience. All sorts of people are studying gestures all over the world. At prestigious institutions like the University of Chicago with the McNeil Gesture Lab, the University of Pennsylvania, and many, many other institutions. Studying gesturing not only as a neuroscience, but as a social science. In other words, what's going on in the brain as a neuroscience issue, and what's going on between you and me, or more importantly, you and your jury as you are attempting to persuade them. And the experts say that gesturing is, number one, natural. Everybody does it. It is absolutely essential in the act of communicating. Number two, those natural gestures help the speaker speak. Literally, the flow of thoughts and words is accompanied by a flow of your natural gestures. And when it comes to persuasion in the courtroom especially, gestures help listeners understand. They actually are an important part of getting a listener to think and see, I see what you're talking about, counsel. I see what you mean, because your hands are an important part of showing me in the flow of these thoughts and these words. And let me give you one final example from contemporary practice. There was a description in the press of Paul Clement, former Solicitor General, who is in this era the person who has practiced in front of the Supreme Court and made more arguments to the U.S. Supreme Court than anyone else. And here's a description of his style, and I memorized it because I use this so often to convince people that even in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, people like Paul Clement, the most experienced advocate, here's the description. Here's what he does. Paul Clement famously argues without notes, leaving his hands free to jab and gesticulate, often as if wringing an imaginary neck. So, if Paul Clement can gesture in front of the Supreme Court, you can gesture in front of the courts in which you are the zealous advocate. So let's look at specifically what our gestures do and why this is so important. Gestures, number one, are natural. Now, I'm not saying you do it like me. You might do it more, you might do it less, but you do it just like you. You need to raise your awareness to that. And you need to start to see other people's gestures. You need to get your eyes off of faces, down onto hands to say, what are they doing? You need to watch television with the sound off and say, I'm just going to focus on hands. Then turn the sound back on and look at the connection between the word and the action of the gesture, as Shakespeare called it. And you need to understand how much those gestures have a natural quality that not only makes you look natural, but helps you talk. And here's that third component about it helps the listener comprehend. It's an interesting challenge to get some sense of, well, what is the impact of gesturing, because we are, for the most part, oblivious to them. So let me give you one small example of how important gestures are to listeners. At the University of Chicago, they work with what they call a gesture mismatch. So instead of doing what Shakespeare said, suit the action to the word, they do just the opposite. They mismatch the gesture to the word, and then they test what the person has learned. And so the person involved in this kind of a study doesn't know it's a gesture study. They are being told a story. I'll give you just one line from that story. The protagonist at one point slid down a pipe and ran across the street. So there are the words. He slid down a pipe and ran across the street. And of course, what would the gesture be that would fit those words? Some sliding gesture, right? He slid down a pipe and ran across the street. But they do a gesture mismatch. Look at my hands. And then he slid down a pipe and ran across the street. Look at that again. He slid down a pipe and ran across the street. Well, testing the listener, you, on what it is that you just heard me say, the listener very often says what? Not slid down a pipe, but he ran down the steps, he tumbled down the stairs, because that's what you saw. You saw what I meant. You saw my meaning. And as a result, that's what stuck. So it helps the listener comprehend what you're saying, and it helps you talk, and it's natural. So your job now is to figure out, what do I do with my hands? So at your desk, at your kitchen table, standing up in the hallway talking to a colleague, ask yourself that question. When I'm being natural, what do I do with my hands? You need to know that answer.
Let's now think about what your gestures probably look like. Now that we've raised your awareness to the fact that you gesture sometimes a little and sometimes a lot, let's think about what kind of gestures we see everyone doing. While your gestures will be unique to you, all of us engage in prototypical gestures that we see worldwide all the time. So next time you're standing up in court and you think, I don't know, I'm supposed to be gesturing, you can choose among these prototypical gestures to jumpstart your instinct. There are 3 types of prototypical gestures. We call them give and chop, and finally show, where we show things. Let's examine each one of those. The first prototypical gesture we call give. It looks exactly like this. I'm giving information. Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, I am giving the traditional boilerplate greeting to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by simply opening up my hands, or I'm giving a question to a witness. When you first had a meeting with them, how many units did you want to buy? So I'm giving the question to a witness, I'm kind of tossing it to them, and I'm also giving them the question literally by opening my hand. Or I could, on cross-examination, do exactly the same thing. You came on deck at 9:30 in the morning. That can almost make a witness answer, and sometimes does. But you are giving them, putting it to the witness with open hands. Not pointing. Pointing is pretty risky in the courtroom, but giving. You choose the attitude that goes with give, but giving is a very useful gesture, especially at the beginning, to get yourself opened up right away. It also helps mitigate adrenaline's effects. If you chose, for example, not to gesture at the beginning and said, for example, you came on deck at 9:30 a.m., your instinct wouldn't be covered up. You'd kind of be stuck in not gesturing, which is a no person's land of nebulous communication. But if you open your hands and give questions, give facts, give argument, it looks real normal because we do it all day long. So notice now when I'm talking about prototypical gestures, exactly what they look like. My hands are open, they're relaxed, you can see air between my fingers. Try that right now. Just look at your hands and give me your name. Say your name to me on the screen and say, hello, my name is so-and-so. Whoever you are, of course, not Marcia Hunter. But look at my hand. Now, tense your hand up. When we see people with a big adrenaline rush, sometimes we see tense gestures. But again, I'm telegraphing that I'm a little bit tense. Or sometimes we see fists when people haven't quite opened up their hands. The give gesture is a great way to offload adrenaline's effects. If your hands are trembling just a little bit, give it away. Give away that trembling right away. Don't keep it to yourself. Let it stay open. So give is the first prototypical gesture you can use, and you can use it for lots of different things. So when we say, use a gesture right away as soon as you begin to speak, try the give gesture. It also gets you this advantage over adrenaline. If you stay closed like this, you are almost tightening adrenaline's loop on you. You'll stay kind of nervous. Look at my nervous posture. We see lots of presentations and examinations begin with the examiner, the speaker, being very tight and keeping elbows locked down to their rib cage and their hands tight. But now, if I open up and I say, good morning, Mrs. Johansson. Please tell us where you live. I've suddenly opened up, I'm friendlier, I'm letting my adrenaline go, and I'm giving my body a message that everything's okay, because this is how I stand when everything is okay. This is how I stand when things are not okay. Right now, alternate between those two postures, all tight and open. This posture can also be, go ahead, hit me, I'm not afraid of you. We want you to fill up the courtroom and be equal to the biggest thing or the biggest, most important person there. So grow into your gestures. Give is a perfect way to start. That's the first prototypical gesture. The second one we call chop. So I'm going to show you kind of a side view. Turn your hands sideways from the give and chop. We do this all day long. We don't see it because gesture is peripheral to our message, the spoken words that are coming out of our mouth. But people chop all the time. We chop for emphasis. We might say, I'm not going to that restaurant. The food is terrible. Or, I saw the condors in the Grand Canyon. They were beautiful. We chop for emphasis. If you don't believe me, watch TV with the sound off, go to a Talking Heads program and watch them chop. They chop all the time for emphasis. They're chopping up a storm. You can chop also. In the courtroom, you can use the chop to kind of organize what you want to say. You might say, the first meeting was in June, the second meeting was in August, and then in September, they made the first purchase. It wasn't until January that they bought the second supply they needed. So I have chopped a chronological order for an entire case just by chopping along the timeline. So you can give, you can chop, and the most interesting type of prototypical gesture is the show gesture. These are the gestures that actually support language by showing us what you mean, so that after these gestures we can say as a fact finder, I see what you mean. Oh, I see what you mean. For example, you might show that a contract got signed. Signing is a very common prototypical gesture. You might see it in the next few days. You're always talking about signing documents in the law, and certainly in the courtroom, we see that often. But notice also, I talked about signing a document. Here was the document in my hand here, and I pantomimed signing it. This may sound cartoonish to you, but in fact, people use show gestures all the time. We see people producing all kinds of pictures with their hands. We've even seen this. They opened the trunk of the guy's car and they took out the box. And when they opened it, guess what was inside? So see, I almost pantomimed the entire thing, but really my gestures were simply showing what happened. We didn't need to have a real car, we didn't need to have a real box, because we all know what that looks like. Show gestures are a shorthand for showing us what you mean. They are your visual aid. And notice that all the gestures we're demonstrating here are nice and slow and smooth and pretty big. So remember, when you stand to speak in court the very next time, gesture immediately and use either give, chop, or show.
So the good news is you already use those prototypical gestures. You already have an instinct, an unconscious instinct to gesture the way you need to gesture. So what you need to do is be ready to gesture. And we need to get your hands into what we would call a ready position. And that ready position is simply the hands ready to gesture as if you're going to gesture on this plane, because most of the gestures happen there. So let's talk very specifically about what do I mean by a ready position. Well, let's reject all the positions that don't work, that aren't ready to go. Since all the gesturing we do takes place in about this area, don't start with your hands too low, here. You're not ready to gesture. Don't start with your hands back here. This is some version of what the military refers to as parade rest, because it's a resting position. Don't start with your hands in your pockets, because now you've holstered those hands and you're not going to gesture. By the ready position, we mean literally your hands loosely touching right here in front of the waist, with the elbow bent at 90 degrees. And it's not this, it's not interlaced fingers as if in prayer. Members of the jury, let us pray that this goes better than I think it might. It's looser than that. So let's look at the options. It might be palm on palm. It could be the reverse palm on palm. It could be fingertips touching. It could be these fingers being held loosely between the thumb and fingers of the other hand. Or if you really want something to hold on to, don't hold a pen. Hold on to your own thumb, what we call the secret handshake. Extend one hand with your palm forward with that thumb out to the side. And now with the other hand, loosely hold that thumb and now pull that gently towards you, but not too tight, so it's not that. It's loose. It's ready to gesture. All those options are available to you. And when you're in this position, you're ready to go. Now here's why you do not want to hold a pen, although many people are tempted to hold a pen. But let's first of all think about how fundamentally this is about speaking, not writing. So why hold a writing utensil while speaking? Of course, if you need to write something down, pick up a writing utensil. But if you hold a pen, here's what will happen. all that energy for gesturing will go into the pen, and you will click it and distract us. If you don't do that, you will twirl it. You will do all sorts of things in the way of clicking and fondling and distracting the jury from what it is that you want them to pay attention to. So don't hold a pen, hold on to yourself. That's what the ready position is. It's close to athletic readiness when you think about it. Throw me the ball, Your Honor, I'm ready to play trial advocacy, but it's the more formal version of that. When you think about the muscles of my arms, there's a little energy in these biceps holding my forearms here, right at waist height. So if you're in this ready position, I guarantee you, once the hands are ready, your instinct to gesture will take off and do those natural gestures. But you've got to be ready, and this is the position.
You have a ready position right about midpoint in your body, right near your belt buckle, right here. Now think about where your hands go when they first start to gesture. They're venturing off onto this plane that Brian described. It's right in front of you, and it's the imaginary plane where most of gesture happens. Now start to think of this area as something we call a shelf. It's a workplace. It's a place where you can put ideas, you can put arguments, you can put stuff here, leave them there, and then come back and talk about them later. Think back to the program where we discussed breath. I said, if you get control of your breath, you'll have 3 benefits. You will feel better, you will speak better, and you'll think better. I deliberately put those 3 things out on a shelf so my hands could help me remember what I was going to talk about. You can structure examinations, openings, arguments, cross-examinations by using the shelf. The shelf always is in front of you. Your listeners, the fact finders, don't see it. They don't see that you're using it. And every time you bring your hands back to a ready position, it theoretically wipes itself clean. It's ready for you to put something else there. It's a powerful kinesthetic mnemonic for organizing your thoughts, the overarching argument that you may have, or what I'm going to talk about for the next 10 minutes, such as you'll feel better, you'll speak better, and you'll think better. My hands actually remember where those 3 things are. And if I wanted to speak about them out of order, I could simply say, let's talk about why you'll speak better. We'll get back to why you'll feel better later. My hands guide me by using the shelf. So I've got kind of an assistant with me, my hands helping me structure what's going on. Notice that if I put things on the shelf, it draws me outward so that I get a little bit bigger. It keeps me from staying too small. And remember, if we stay small, adrenaline is looping. But if we get big, that's kind of the friendly or the brave stance that we want to be in. And that's how we reach for things that we have put onto a shelf. You can use it all the time. No one sees it, and it draws you out, makes you larger, and makes your gestures smoother and slower. You could use a shelf that was really small and you put things right here, but if you let it expand, you'll get bigger, and it helps mitigates adrenaline's effects. It also is a memory device, a mnemonic device, which we'll talk about soon. But your hands know where you've put things onto the shelf. Use it. It's almost magic, not quite.
With the idea that you have a ready position and you're working on the shelf and you're going to jumpstart your instinct to gesture by placing things on the shelf, we need to add one more idea to literally flesh out your understanding. And that is that there is a zone of gesturing, a zone that I'm inscribing in space. The bottom of that zone is the shelf, but that zone, for most of us as we gesture, is about shoulder height and out to the side, 3, 4, 5 feet, depending on the length of your arms. You want to use that zone. You want to occupy that zone to look comfortable and natural. So you need to pay attention in everyday conversation to how big are your gestures sitting in an easy chair in your living room when you're just relaxed and saying, hey, what'd you do last weekend? And look at how big that zone of gesturing is. We're occupying that zone with gestures that are slow and smooth because that's what we do when we're our relaxed, comfortable selves. But here's an important thing to understand. Naturally, when having an adrenaline rush, the body stays tight and closed to protect itself. It's that feeling of the body not being comfortable. So everyone, when gesturing consciously, even if they get their hands to this ready position, tends at the very beginning to have the gestures be initially just from fingers, and then from wrists, and then from elbows, and eventually after a while from the shoulder. So you need more air in the armpits if you want to look comfortable, because if your upper arm is tight against your rib cage and you're only gesturing from the elbow, there's a robotic stiffness about that that doesn't work. So you need to fully occupy the zone. And that's the advantage of this idea that there's a shelf. Let's place something on the shelf. And consider this as a gestural pattern or template. Isn't all litigation, when you think about it as a gestural pattern, about a plaintiff, a defendant, and a problem between them that brings us to this courtroom? Or if it's a criminal case, there's a prosecutor, there's a defendant, and there's a criminal charge between them. So isn't that a way to say for the rest of your career, oh, that's one way to loosen up. When I talk about the plaintiff, I'll be over here. When I talk about the defendant here, and now let's talk about the problem. So we've got that ability to say, this is actually quite simple. I need to be ready, conceive of a shelf that is a full zone of gesturing, and now slowly and smoothly, because that will make me look and feel more comfortable, I'm going to put things on the shelf, I'm going to occupy that zone. And presence, when you think about it, is not some mystical notion, it's how much space do you take up. Look at how, as I talk to you and I shrink the space that I'm taking up, I become an increasingly less present person and increasingly less comfortable person. So your job is to be ready to gesture, to put something on the shelf slower and smoother, and to occupy that zone of gesture. You want to have presence in the courtroom.
Now you know how thinking, speaking, and gesturing are connected. So right now, talk to yourself and say this.
Raise your hands to the ready position and gesture immediately. Say that.
Jumpstart your gestures by putting a word or phrase on the shelf. Say that and gesture it at the same time.
Say this. My gestures will feel more natural and look more natural if they're slow and smooth. Say that.
And finally, use the give gesture to give away some of your nervousness. Gesture it and say it.